Welcome into the Ema Online Podcast. I'm Mason Voth. Been a while since we've done one of these, but Big 12 Media Days wrapped up yesterday, and that was the first time since Spring Bowl wrapped up that we got an opportunity to hear from Chris Kleiman and members of the Wildcats. So they got the day two treatment. I started it off. They were the first one of the day. Not sure how many times that the reigning Big 12 champ has to start one of the mornings, but Wildcats got everything taken care of. Definitely more interest in them this year, it would seem, coming off of that. Also, probably just more respect in general from a lot of people that realize just how much more seriously they have to take K-State coming off of the Big 12 title, especially when they return on offense essentially everybody from last year. That you only lose three players of serious significance, and obviously they're pretty significant ones in Deuce Vaughn at running back, Malik Knowles and Cade Warner at wide receiver. But K-State brings back the quarterback that caught fire from the second he took the ball against TCU the first time last year in Will Howard. And then you look around, Ben Sinnott is a guy that really K-State didn't start to see the full capabilities of him until later in the year. He had the game against Oklahoma that at the time everybody was like, what the heck is going on with Ben Sinnott tonight? Like what's happening here? But as the season wore on and you got down to Baylor, West Virginia, the Big 12 championship game, Ben Sinnott was constantly making plays. So that's a big deal. Obviously, the biggest news of the offseason was all five of the starting offensive linemen being back for K-State and then some, because you think about the guys that started in the Big 12 championship game, you were missing a guy like Taylor Poitier, who was a starter at the beginning of the season and instantly got hurt, was knocked out for the year, and then a bunch of other guys that are in contention to see reps if they were on any other team in the league. And I still think that K-State probably ultimately has a different starting offensive line by the end of the season versus what they start the year with. My guess is they go with the consistency of the Big 12 title, but at some point, I think some of these younger guys that are a big part of what K-State does and what they think they have moving forward are probably going to slide in there and make some of those steps. So you got that going for you. Some of the newcomers on offense help solidify and make it a little bit better. And so the offense seems great. Seems like it's rolling and ready to go. Defensively, that's where some things are up for debate. You have a decent amount of guys returning. It helps to have experienced linebackers like Daniel Green and Austin Moore back. Austin Moore was one of the biggest revelations of last season. Probably him and Brendan Mott, the two guys on defense that had really, really special years for K-State, and they'll be able to kind of increase what is expected out of them. And in addition to that, it feels like you're going to get a truly healthy Daniel Green in his this is actually his final year of college football, folks. He's been around for a while, but this will be his last year. And so I think that is something to take into consideration. Just a lot to kind of dig around, get into from Big 12 Media Days. Well, obviously hit K-State and some of the news that came out of that really hard to get things going. And then as we wind things down, also take a look at some of the other notes and thoughts that I had watching every single one of the coaches down there and how they handled their press conferences and their attitudes, because I think I've learned this because my first time at Big 12 Media Days was Chris Kleiman's first, would have been 2019. And the instant takeaway from that one was Les Miles had lost it. Les Miles was, I mean, it was, you could just tell something was not going to work out there. And obviously there wasn't one in 2020. Go down for 2021, and I'm not sure what the major takeaway there was. Maybe it had to do with the fact that KU wasn't going to have a good season because they didn't even show up. But 2022, last year, that you could tell based off of how Neil Brown was down there that he was very nervous about what was going on that year. He was visibly shaken whenever he spoke to big crowds down in Arlington. And what happened? West Virginia had a less than stellar season, even with JT Daniels at quarterback, and they put themselves in a position where he almost didn't come back for this year. And I've got some thoughts on how some of the coaches reacted this year, despite the fact that I was not able to actually be down there this year. As most of you have probably seen or heard, and I posted on the EMA online message boards, I did not go down because we are less than a month away from my wife having our first baby. So didn't want to be 5.5 hours away from home and then something happened. So that was tough for me, and for a couple of reasons. I love being down there. I love Big 12 Media Day, and in addition to that, like it sucked from the standpoint of I wasn't able to give the adequate coverage and deservedness that was there for the coverage for everybody that follows along at EMA Online and here on the YouTube page as well. So unfortunately wasn't able to do that, but was still able to watch everything that came out of it, whether that be the press conferences that were on ESPN Plus, which was every single one of them, or some of the other content that was put out by some of the great places that also helped cover K-State, like KSNT. I thought the work that Glenn Kinley did down there covering the Cats on day two was great stuff. So I would encourage anybody to go follow Glenn on Twitter and follow the breadcrumbs to any of the stuff that they did. Obviously, the big hit in it was what our I don't know, maybe you're friends with him. I know I am. What John Kurtz and Cole Manbeck did for Kansas City Sports Network with Tim Weiser, who I tell you what, he has ruffled some Texas feathers, and I'm not sure that anybody cares except for Texas and Oklahoma people. And there's no reason for anybody else to care about it because those guys are going to be gone in 11 months. So they're going to cause a headache for you. You can tell them to screw off. It's not going to do anything. I think that might be the funniest aspect of anybody from Texas or Oklahoma that's upset about this. And probably if you're upset about it, it's probably because it's true to some extent. I think that his words that he shared there were pretty on the spot. So I would encourage anybody to go listen to that because he did a lot of other great stuff there, obviously sharing stuff from his time as athletic director at K-State. But he was really good there with John and Cole. So I wish we would have been able to have covered it from a better landscape and view. Unfortunately, the circumstances of when this kid is coming has hurt me. But at least she'll be here by the time football actually is being played, so won't have to take too many back seats to that actual stuff. So let's dive into it. A couple of things off the top that I noted about K-State down at Media Days. I think that they're the number one thing that caught everybody. I didn't really catch anybody by surprise, but it was the first big thing that popped out at everybody when Chris Kleiman got up on the podium. First thing in the morning yesterday was when he was asked the question about going from being the hunters to the hunted and explaining some of the stuff behind that and how that's going to work out for K-State. And I mean, Chris Kleiman was not shy from it, and he was ready to lean into it because he said that K-State was excited for that role, or at least he was excited for that role. And he also hit on it, and he's absolutely right. He's well equipped to be in this position, to be in this role from his time at North Dakota State. Nobody was hunted more than Chris Kleiman in college football, except for maybe Nick Saban, for basically the last decade. Like, he knows what this is like. He has dealt with it, and he has put up with any of the pressures that comes with it, or having to be able to erase everything that kind of comes from the year prior, even though there's a lot of good stuff, a lot of special things that can happen. But at the end of the day, you start to think about it, and you got to shift your focus and start to look ahead to what's going on this year. So I think that he is obviously the perfect guy to embrace that role. It's an important thing for K-State to do, and him setting the tone by it and just leaning into it, I think just shows off the confidence he has in himself and this year's team at K-State. But some of the other things that he said along those lines was basically that at North Dakota State, their expectations were they won a championship, and then they had to follow it up with another championship. They couldn't go through and just, okay, hey, we won one, we've bought ourselves some time. If Chris Kleiman had gone and won a championship and then gone 2 years without winning one, he's probably on the hot seat up there for what the standard was at North Dakota State. So very significant that he has that experience. And that doesn't mean K-State is going to repeat as Big 12 champs this year. Now, they have as good of a chance as anybody in the league. But what it does mean is they're at least going to be prepared enough to put themselves in that position and be ready to go. And the other thing that they're going to be able to have is continuity from last year's team to this year's team. Obviously, they lose some really significant pieces when you have 4 guys get taken in the NFL draft from a team that won the Big 12 championship. It's going to be a little bit tougher. But when you bring back your quarterback, you bring back the entire offensive line, including a guy in Cooper Beebe that's probably going to be a first-round pick this upcoming year. You've got a tight end that can make plays like Ben Sinnott, who I think is going to expand his role even more pretty quickly. And then some of the guys on defense that are going to be able to be leaders. Like, it's significant to have 2 experienced linebackers coming back. And that's why, with everything going on here, this feels a little bit different than what K-State had go on in the Big 12 championship year 10 years ago in 2012 to the 2013 season, where obviously it was significant that K-State had to go ahead and replace Colin Klein at quarterback. And that's certainly a really, really big deal to do, because that was a Heisman finalist that you were having to replace at quarterback. You were having to replace guys on defense that were major impact type guys for you. Obviously, Arthur Brown was there. Ty Zimmerman was another guy. And there were just a lot of spots and a lot of circumstances that K-State had to replace that time. Now, obviously, you still had a guy like Tyler Lockett that was there, and that helped. And it's not like they didn't bring in talented guys, but it took a little bit of time for that group to find their speed and their steam, and they eventually did. 2013 was an all right season for K-State. 2014 was a better year for K-State, but it took time. It took kind of settling in and getting everything figured out. So I don't know. I just think that K-State's in a better spot this year to move forward. And in addition to that, I think we're going to see this team has already figured out the right way to appreciate and look at a lot of things. Because another thing that Chris Kleiman said while I was down there, and this was in an interview he was doing with SiriusXM when he was on, he said, "You're going to get knocked off if you fall in love with yourself pretty quickly." And said that was last year's team. This group hasn't done anything yet. And even though there are a lot of guys on this team that have done something, I do think that they have the attitude and the mentality to accept that we are essentially a new group this year. You can be in certain situations in life where you can do one thing with one group, but when you come back a year later or however many years later and you do it with somebody else, you still have that motivation because it's a team aspect. And so there are going to be guys on this team that haven't done it, or guys that feel like they weren't as big of a part of it last year and they want to take on that role this year. They want to be a bigger part of it. And I think that that's where K-State is. They have the guys that have the big time experience, were key players in last year's title team, that are going to look at their teammates and say, "Hey, look, we understand this is a different group. We want to win it with you. We want to win it for you this year. So you feel like you're a bigger part of it." I just think that they have the right approach. And one other thing that maybe it is not as small as I'm going to try to act like it is, because I don't want to put too much stock into it, but I thought it was really interesting. If you look at any of the pictures that were taken at Big 12 Media Days yesterday featuring K-State, I would ask some people. If I was in a mall and I was giving out the Family Feud quiz, I would be like, okay, I'm going to ask 100 people, what was the first thing that you noticed about these pictures? Every single picture of Chris Kleiman or any of the players that showed up for K-State. And for me, the first thing that I noticed was that the giant ring that they won for winning the Big 12 was not on a single one of those guys. Chris Kleiman, I think, was the only one wearing a ring. He was wearing his wedding ring. But outside of that, there was no sight of the Big 12 championship ring on Chris Kleiman or any of the players there. And yesterday would have been the absolute perfect time to show it off and wear it around and do whatever you had to. I mean, every guy that was there was on the team last year and won the Big 12 title. Every single guy that was there was a major part of the Big 12 title last year. And they definitely earned the opportunity and the chance to wear that thing whenever and wherever they want. But they chose not to wear them yesterday. And that would be something that the next time we get a chance to talk to a player or Chris Kleiman about that, I think that's something that's going to be worth asking about why the Big 12 championship ring was absent at Big 12 Media Days. And I think it's not like a major deal. It doesn't mean that K-State is winning the Big 12 because of that, but it does show that everything that Chris Kleiman said when he was down in Arlington is the absolute truth. and that he believes it, his team believes it, and they're not just saying the right things to say the right things. Like if Chris Kleiman had been at the podium and he was up there and he was saying, well, I'm excited about it. The new group, all this stuff. You can't fall in love with yourself, but he's doing it and he's waving his hands around. And you keep seeing flashes of the giant rocks on the Big 12 championship ring. It would seem a little disingenuous, but instead they all showed up, and it is like a new season. It is like it's a new group, and it's a totally new goal this year, despite what they did last year. And I think that the approach is probably there's going to be a lot of time in life to appreciate what we did in the 2022 football season down the road. But while we're still here, let's put together a season that we can also appreciate in the aftermath of that. I think it's significant. I mean, there were a bunch of guys that showed up down there that could have wore Big 12 championship rings at Big 12 Media Days. They didn't. Meanwhile, a guy at a different school decided to show up wearing an Apple Watch around his neck that was playing highlights of himself from a team that went 6-7. So I just, the priorities are different in some places, I guess, even in the same state. So that was the number one thing, an overall message from Big 12 Media Day that K-State tried to convey was about the hunters to the hunted and how they're ready to embrace it and how they've been able to lock in, refocus, and be prepared for everything that's going to come their way and how they're going to be able to put themselves in a position to get back into competing for a Big 12 title and push everything out of the way that took place last year. So that is the number one thing to kind of come away with. Another thing that I was interested in finding out from some of the things that were said at Big 12 Media Days was what was the status of the wide receiver situation? Where was the look there? We know that Keegan Johnson and Phillip Brooks were going to be 1 and 2 somehow. The good news that came in the top of the pecking order in the receiver room is that Chris Kleiman and Will Howard both seem very impressed with Keegan Johnson so far. It does seem like he's going to put himself in position. He'll be the top receiver. He can make some pretty serious plays for the Wildcats. That's a big deal. Even said that Will Howard and Keegan Johnson and Chris Kleiman said this, that they worked a lot this summer to try and foster a strong connection as they get ready to head into the season, because that's something that we saw last year is that it was pretty evident that Will Howard had a pretty good connection with obviously Ben Sinnott, number one. I mean, that was an electric duo late in the season last year. Will Howard had the confidence to throw a ball wherever, and Ben Sinnott would make some great catches with minimal hole to get the ball through to catch it. So obviously there's one there. And I think even Cade Warner to an extent, Will Howard had some pretty good connection with. We saw Cade Warner's production take off with Will Howard at quarterback. Now, obviously every receiver kind of saw a bump in that, but Cade Warner went from a guy that I was pleased with what he did in 2021 for K-State to a guy in 2022 that was making genuine plays, not just, oh, hey, that was a nice grab that you had to have on 3rd and 6. That was great. 7-yard gain, first down. It went from that to when Will Howard took over at quarterback, Cade Warner was making 20, 25-yard plays, catching touchdown passes, all this stuff. So I think that Will Howard has proven that he is a quarterback that thrives when he has a connection with certain guys. To hear that he and Keegan Johnson are working on that and that Keegan Johnson has started to do as much as he can to fit in immediately, that's a pretty big deal for K-State. But that wasn't really the part of the wide receiver situation that I was most intrigued by for K-State. What I was most looking forward to was hearing about, okay, who's going to be behind Keegan Johnson and Phillip Brooks? We knew that the two key contenders were going to be Jaden Jackson, who transferred from Ole Miss ahead of last season, was here last year, redshirted, all that good stuff, or RJ Garcia, who has been in the program now a couple of years, was a redshirt freshman last year, and everybody's going to remember and think of the touchdown catch that he had in the Big 12 championship game. And I think for a lot of people, that catch probably in their mind and eyes put RJ Garcia into that 3rd spot. And honestly, that's kind of the way I saw it too, where we saw both guys on the field in very small roles last year. Jaden Jackson caught 2 passes. RJ Garcia caught 7. But Garcia made that play in the Big 12 title game that at least shows you that he can do it in some fashion. Now, can he do it enough? Has he developed himself enough in other ways to make this something that it can be a regular occurrence and make him the third receiver. But it does seem like we have some clarity that as of right now, RJ Garcia is that third receiver to get on the field and on the depth chart. Now, the other side, we'll flip to the other side of the ball real quick and think about this. We know that the offense is pretty much set, and that's how Chris Kleiman talked about it at Big 12 Media Days. The praise was high for Will Howard, for the running back room of DJ Giddens and Trayshawn Ward, for the offensive line, all that. And like I just talked about, he's very confident in what his receivers can do. But it was clear that the thing that he was most uncertain about was the secondary for K-State. And it's not like he came out there and was like, yeah, the secondary is going to be pretty bad this year. We're going to have to try and find a way to mask that. But I think he was honest enough in just how he assessed the secondary. And he talked about all the positions that are going to step up and guys that can help and all this other stuff. And he got to talking about, and kind of to my surprise, he seems to be feeling really good about the front seven. Obviously, defensive end, I wasn't as worried about that as maybe some people were with losing Felix Anudike-Uzomah. Obviously, he's a huge part of it, but K-State has a lot of good depth there, and they had a lot of guys that are coming back that made plays even last year or in past years, so I'm not too worried about that. Obviously, linebacker, we've talked about how K-State feels like they're in a good spot there, but defensive tackle was one that seemed a little bit iffy, but Uso Sayamalu, he got praise down there. Damian Ilalio got some praise as well. It was interesting to not hear, at least nothing that I took in, involved Javon Banks' name, but I don't know that means anything bad. It just means that the other guys who have been in the program stood out in spring and through workouts and everything else. I think there's a lot of room. Either way, it seems like they aren't as worried about that, even though they probably know this, and we should all understand it. There's going to be a drop-off in how K-State is able to perform at that position this year. No matter how well Uso or Ilalio plays, or Banks or whoever gets in that mix, none of them are going to be Eli Huggins this year. I mean, Eli Huggins was just so important and special for K-State last season. So that's something to take into consideration. But Chris Kleiman felt good about that. Said he was good with the front seven. But he didn't come out and trash the secondary, but he made it clear that that's the group that is going to take some moving along at a slower pace and making sure that they have the right guys in the right spots for a little bit, because we know that they lost a lot from that position last year. Julius Brents, Echo Boydo, gone at corner. And then you lose Josh Hayes, who was a major part of all of that. Sincere Mason is a guy that is gone that played okay in times when he was on the field. So you're looking around, you got to find all these different guys to fit in there. And the dudes that will have to step up for K-State at that position this year are guys that have pretty good experience despite their age, but they are still young guys regardless of how you see it. Jacob Parrish and VJ Payne played well at times last season when they were thrown into the fray a little bit earlier on, but they are still young. They are still going to have some learning experiences. And that's an area that I think is going to be interesting for K-State to watch as the season kind of gets underway. The good news, I would say in some aspects, is how the schedule starts out ultimately for K-State. It's not like it's, the toughest that they could have faced. SEMO, obviously, that is what it is. And then we'll see what kind of Troy and Missouri bring. Missouri, just the quarterback situation will be a little bit iffy. And like UCF and Oklahoma State, UCF will be a little bit dicey, but it's a home game. So that will help a little bit and it, whatever. But John Rice Plumlee is a good quarterback coming into this league for UCF. The game at Oklahoma State, I don't have any worry at all about who they're throwing out there at quarterback. And then also, even though Presley is back, they lost some other guys like John Paul Richardson, who transferred to TCU. So I'm not overly concerned about that. I think that is going to help. Now, they are going to have to start to get things kind of into gear, because you will eventually start to face some better quarterbacks in this league. They have to go to Lubbock in mid-October, and there was a lot of love for Tyler Shuck this week, not just by Joey McGuire, but from other people. It's deserved. It's just a matter of, can he stay on the field? We'll see what Chandler Morris brings for TCU this year. That'll be a little bit interesting. Houston, if Donovan Smith is fine. I like to watch him play, but he's not in line with some of these other quarterbacks. But the latter half of the year, you are going to run into guys that not only have experience in the league, but two of the guys for sure that are top-end quarterbacks in the league, and Quinn Ewers and Jalen Daniels. So that is going to be something that is to be monitored when the passing game becomes a bigger emphasis against some of the teams you play this year. Ultimately, though, like, K-State is going to benefit from not having to play Oklahoma this year in that respect, because Dylan Gabriel is another one of those quarterbacks that I would put up there. But that's the area of biggest concern right now. And that's probably going to be the most fascinating group to follow the noise out of fall camp from. So once practices start, which we know that's going to be August 2nd now, Chris Kleiman said that in Arlington yesterday. But following that group and seeing how the progression is, and what do guys like Joe Klanderman and Van Malone, when we get to hear from them, say about those guys, and where does Chris Kleiman see things when he first gets there versus when you get to the middle of the fall camp and then you get closer to the start of the season. So that's the position group that still needs the most work. And here's the good news. The secondary was the group last year that was probably the biggest concern coming into the year. And K-State lost some guys throughout the season in that spot and a bunch of other things, and it still worked out. It turned into a strength for them with how some of those guys played. So even though you go into a season with some of your major concerns being at this position, doesn't mean that it's going to be like that the entire year. So that's something to keep in mind as well, and very important to note as we get closer to the start of everything. And I guess 18 days, 19 days, whatever it is here from Friday, when fall camp ultimately gets started. One other thing that seemed to be a pretty common theme and occurrence down there for K-State was everybody's confidence in Will Howard. That was essentially the word that was used a lot, was that there was confidence and belief, and everybody was rallying behind Will Howard because they know what he can do. They've always known what he can do. Then he went out and he did it on the field last year. He put that all together. Very significant, I think, to see how things went with all that. And they believe in him, and he's worked to get better this year. So now Will Howard gets the opportunity to come in knowing he's a starter. He has all the confidence and belief in himself now from what he did last year. His teammates have all of that. And also, I mean, this is no small thing. The fan support behind Will Howard is at a much different level than it's ever been in his career. Because I think when he makes some throws or whatever that happens in 2023, there's going to be support. There's not going to be as much worry there. And that's one of the other things. And I'll have more on this as we get closer to the start of the season with some other predictions. I wouldn't panic. I think Will Howard's going to throw more interceptions this year. I know that sounds simple because he's going to play more games, but if you want to say that his interceptions per game is going to go up, I would say yes to that, because I think he will take more chances. He will make more throws. And you have to live and die by some of that when you have a quarterback that is as good as Will Howard and doing enough to make himself better. So that is the major takeaways from everything that K-State had going on down there, and a pretty productive ho-hum media day for the Wildcats as well. Some of the other takeaways from the rest of Big 12 media days, I'll dive into this. There were a lot of guys in the newcomers that tried to manage where their expectations were for this year, including some of the returning teams to the Big 12. Of the newcomers that I think tried to set the bar at an adequate level, one of which was Scott Satterfield on Thursday. Scott Satterfield, he wasn't coming in there over-promising. And if you go to EMA Online and read both days of the story on the takeaways from each day that I did, free stories, by the way. So if you're not signed up for EMA Online right now, go take those in and get signed up. but in each one, I highlighted a specific quote from each coach, and I thought that this was the telling one for Scott Satterfield. He said, "We haven't played a game yet, so I think that is going to take a few years to ingrain in high school players and coaches. It will take time, but we are also in a world where you don't have much time." And that came off the backs of also saying other things like, being a newcomer, we haven't played in this league. We haven't played the teams that are in the league, so you don't really understand the ins and outs of the team that you're getting ready to play. He made mention of just how many transfers Cincinnati has on the roster. They have 21 transfers this season. They lost the entire wide receiver room from 2022. They brought in a new quarterback in Emory Jones, who's been at Florida and Arizona State now. And obviously, Scott Satterfield is new. He left Louisville to take the job at Cincinnati after Luke Fickell. And he seemed to make it pretty clear, like he didn't want to overpromise anything at Big 12 Media Days. And I think that he's pretty reserved about what the chances are for Cincinnati to be a good team right now. Obviously, he thinks that it can come later, but he's also aware that there just may not be time to reach into that. Some of the other guys that I thought were trying to shy away from putting much expectation on their teams this year. Matt Campbell was one of those. As always, Matt Campbell, not a guy that wants to talk about wins and losses unless it's a 2020 COVID season when everybody else is sick with a pandemic and his team miraculously skates through it and has the best luck of anybody and blah, 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 everything that went down with that. Matt Campbell wanted to talk about how often his team was going to be good off the football field, the non-football stuff that the Cyclones were good at. He brought that up when he was asked about what it was going to take for Iowa State to get back to competing for a Big 12 title, which I thought was funny. And then he also, while his team is in the middle of an investigation for gambling, which is a no-no with the NCAA, he basically was just like, yeah, well, I don't really know much about it right now. Might have a decision coming soon. But hey, I want this to be a learning lesson for our guys and all this other stuff. Here's the quote from Matt Campbell that kind of made me laugh. He said, "The one thing that I've always said about our program, and you look at our 7-8 years, is we've been worthy to suffer sometimes. I think at our place, our ability and hopefully our humility to understand why there have been setbacks and whatever has impeded us has been able to dissect that and then come together as one to empower us forward." The man just wants his team to be together and learn lessons, which is great, but at some point, throw some more wins in there. There wasn't a whole lot of football that I took away from what Matt Campbell said at Media Day, which leads me to believe that this might be another shaky year for them. I'm not sold on the Hunter Deckers thing, and it would obviously seem that Matt Campbell doesn't seem too locked into that as well. Other guys that I thought that were pretty careful about what they did expectation-wise, Lance Leipold did it, but I think he did it in a good way. Lance Leipold is accepting of the expectations that are being put on KU, but he also wants to mix it with reality and try and find a way to keep guys locked in the right way, not to put too much into them. He said this program hasn't had many expectations of late, so embracing those, but keeping them in balance. So his whole point, it seemed to me, was about, look, we have to embrace these expectations in some way because that's good for KU football right now because nobody's had them for over a decade, and it helps breathe life into the program. It's good for it, but also it may not be the best for the team. And I think he also doesn't want it to be leaned into so much that when KU does go 6-6 this year or 5-7, it's not looked at as like a massive failure. Now, as good of a chance as there is that KU does go 5-7 and 6-6, I would also say there is equal enough of a chance that they go 7-5 or 8-4. Like, this is a KU team that things could really go and turn either way for them this year based off of kind of an interesting schedule. Like, you've got swing games the second week of the season. Illinois comes to Lawrence on a Friday night. That's going to be an important one for determining your overall record, and some other games tossed in there. And I think that he did a good job of balancing it, but he didn't want to commit to putting too many expectations on the team when he got there. Another guy that did that was Sonny Dykes, obviously coming off of a monstrous season last year. TCU was able to rip through, win 13 games. They went 13-2, lost in the national championship game to Georgia. And he said the challenge this year will be to not take on the burden of expectations from last year. To me, that is Sonny Dykes saying, like, Chris Kleiman is saying that as well, like different group, all this stuff. It is a way more different group for TCU. Sonny Dykes lost, I think, at least 7 guys to the NFL draft, including Max Duggan, including Quentin Johnson, including Travius Hodges Tomlinson. Like, all of these guys are gone from TCU's team last year that made them really good. And I think that he is aware that this team obviously is not going to make it to a national championship game this year. And in all likelihood, probably isn't going to be in the Big 12 title game race. And he is aware that the guys on this year's team might feel the wrath and might feel the pain of not living up to expectations that are, in all honesty, unrealistic for many years for TCU. Like, they are always going to be, I think, a pretty good team. He obviously knows what he's doing down there, but to come in year one and you set the bar that high for yourself, and then the year after that, a lot of people around the country are probably going to expect more from TCU. I think Sonny Dykes was aware that he needs to be careful, and that's going to be a challenge, is managing kind of the expectations of his team. Now, one guy, and I mentioned Neil Brown earlier, about a guy that you could look at and you could say, okay, I know exactly how this season is going to go down. Neil Brown was not shy about his emotions and how he felt about some of the things that took place at Big 12 Media Day, or leading into Big 12 Media Days. He came out very strong and very pissed off and said that the media is wrong. The quote about him, he is upset about the media poll. Definitely don't agree with that. The positive is the media has not been successful in predicting the Big 12 the last few years. A couple of other things that Neil Brown said. He wanted to make it clear that this ruined his vacation. He was on the beach when he got the text that the Big 12 media poll had come out and West Virginia was dead last, and it ruined the rest of the vacation for him. Vacation was over at that point, he said. And he also wanted to make it clear the media was wrong because West Virginia played well against Oklahoma and Oklahoma State last year at the end of the season. They won those games. Now, anybody that watched the Big 12 last year knows that if you won a game against Oklahoma or Oklahoma State in the last half of the season, that is nothing to brag about. That is not anything to brag about. If you played Oklahoma State after the game in Manhattan, stop talking about it. Oklahoma is the only one that can brag about it because they beat the snot out of their in-state rival. KU can talk about it because it was a big win for their program, and they won 6 games. It got them into a bowl game, winning that game. I don't want to hear West Virginia talk about their win against Oklahoma State last year. I mean, it was bad weather. It was a zombie-like Oklahoma State team that was just cruising to a brutal finish. A little ridiculous there. In that Oklahoma game, I mean, the weather was terrible. I don't even know if Dylan Gabriel was healthy in that game. It was just, I was in a stretch of bad football for Oklahoma. So, again, that is something that I just thought was kind of funny with how Neil Brown handled it. But hey, he's probably trying to fire his team up. That's a guy that knows that he's probably on his last leg. So got to do what you got to do there. Let's see, I'm looking at this. Okay, Dylan Gabriel did play in that game. So I'll give West Virginia a little credit. It still wasn't a great Oklahoma team at that point in the season. So I thought that his approach was interesting. Another guy that took an approach that, look, I'm not a Steve Sarkisian guy, but I will give Steve Sarkisian credit for this. He is a guy that, as many coaches showed up that are not wanting to lean too far into some of the expectations for their team, that is a guy that is clearly carrying the burden of what expectations for Texas are this year and understanding that it is time for Texas to live up to those expectations. Everything that he said was rooted in winning the Big 12 championship, essentially. Basically, every question ended with, this is what we got to do. This is what we can do with these guys. We just actually have to go out and do it on a Saturday. If we do that, we're going to put ourselves in a position to compete for a championship. It seemed like every question was so much focused on what you do every single Saturday. And as much as I don't ultimately think Steve Sarkisian is the savior of Texas football, he could have some good seasons there, but I think you're going to have a lot more 7 and 8 win seasons than anything else with Steve Sarkisian. He is at least taking the responsibility and the understanding of how this works and knows what has beaten this Texas team in the past. And that is they don't bring it every Saturday, or they don't do some of these little things every Saturday that bring them to what their talent level says that they should be at. So I give props to Steve Sarkisian for how he handled it. And obviously Texas has a focus this year. With that said, Steve Sarkisian can do all that he wants. He's still going to be Steve Sarkisian, and Texas football is still going to have some of the boneheaded mistakes and everything else that goes on with it. They're going to lose some games they shouldn't, and yeah, they're not going to be in Arlington this year. There you go. There you have it. Everything else, I don't know. I mean, Dave Aranda was kind of weird. Again, it didn't give me any more confidence that he's going to be able to be successful long-term in this thing. I think he's missing Joey McGuire and a lot of the staff that left with McGuire when they went to Texas Tech. He also seemed to allude that they had some problems last season, similar to what K-State went through in 2020, where there were probably some bad characters, divisive guys in the locker room. And Dave Aranda said that he tried too hard to fix certain players, and that was probably to the detriment of the entire team. So that was fascinating to me. Mike Gundy, obviously Mike Gundy he may be a man and he may be 40, 50, whatever age he is now. Mike Gundy is a 50-year-old man with the mind of a 75-year-old man, with how crotchety and cranky he was about how college football has changed. He had this golden line on NIL and the transfer portal. He said, quote, "We have almost got to the point considering NIL and transfer portal like religion and politics. It's not even worth discussing anymore." And what that means is when you don't want to discuss that stuff, typically it's because you have an unpopular take on that type of thing. Like the people that don't want to, that say, "I don't want to talk about that, keep this out of this," whatever. It's typically because you don't have a take that is going to be universally accepted or lauded. And honestly, smart of Mike Gundy, because if he went up there with his true thoughts and feelings about NIL and the transfer portal and went into great detail about it, it would absolutely tank any chance Oklahoma State had of rebounding in all of this, because even if you hate something, you have to embrace it in some way. And that was the thing that, honestly, like if Bill Snyder had gone on any longer at K-State, that's what would have happened. Like it would have been even more of a detriment to K-State, because Bill Snyder didn't believe or like in a lot of the stuff that was happening with the changes in college football. And because of that, he just didn't even accept it at all. You can hate how the game is played. You still have to play it if you want to be successful at it. And I think at least credit to Mike Gundy in this regard. He realized he couldn't go all the way and say anything about that. Now, the one thing that I will absolutely take Mike Gundy's side on is how he's handling the divorce of Oklahoma and Oklahoma State and the Bedlam rivalry. He was asked about that, and he said, "I'm going to go back to what I said earlier. Oklahoma State is not going to change what we do because Oklahoma chose to go to the SEC. They need to change what they do because they're the ones that made their mind up to go to the SEC." So there you have it. He is all about throwing it on them. Those are my major takeaways for everything that happened with some of the other guys at Big 12 Media Day. Brent Venables was a guy that he addressed a little bit of the problems and started to point out what they needed to do to be better from last year, and understood that 6 and 7 really wasn't acceptable. Really, basically, defense needs to be corrected for Oklahoma to be better. But the number one thing, he was just waxing poetic nostalgia about the old Big 8 and Big 12, talking about his memories of that and everything else. He went on and said, "I played at Kansas State as a former Big 8 and had the good fortune to coach in the very first Big 12 and in game and conference history." Talked about all the dudes that were there for Texas Tech at the time, preparing for them when he was coaching under Bill Snyder at K-State. And then ended with saying, "All my opportunities in my life that I've been here as a coach have all come from this conference, the Big 8, the Big 12, the coaches, the great mentors that I've had, and all the amazing players that have helped me have a career of success." So Brent Venables probably showed the most love for the Big 12 out of anybody that was there, because he was very kind to the Big 12 on his way out. So those were the takeaways there from Big 12 Media Days and everything else going on. And now we'll just kind of wait and see how and what all of this stuff that we heard over the last 2 days actually means going into this upcoming season. Like I said, I think you can tell a lot by the way coaches act in these press conferences and in these media day settings. They start to have a pretty good idea of what their team is like and what the future is going to hold. And so they will start to put together, and there will be some things to fall and say, okay, I know what this guy is thinking. So for a guy like Scott Satterfield, we know that he is prepared for a long year at Cincinnati, 4 or 5 wins, something like that. Gus Malzahn, he understands that while UCF has been a team that has won 8, 9, 10 games in recent years, this team is going to be competitive in the Big 12. Good chance they only win like 7 games this year total in the Big 12, going 7-5, something like that. Joey McGuire was leaning all the way into it. He is very much aware that his team has a lot of hype around it, and he's excited about guys being in place for consecutive years in a row. He talked about how Tyler Shuck had never had the same offensive coordinator in consecutive years until this coming year. That's a big deal. So you can just tell by the vibe of these coaches and where things are headed. And just I think, pretty ho-hum Big 12 Media Day, because it is this fun time of a bunch of newcomers in the league. So you're welcoming those 4. There's no bad blood there yet. And now the bad blood has kind of at least moved a little bit. Now, the Tim Weiser comments got Texas and Oklahoma people all up in their feelings again. Whatever, screw them. Who cares? If you're so happy about going to the SEC, you don't need to cry about anything that's happening in the Big 12 now. And the Big 12, it doesn't care one bit how Texas and Oklahoma feels now. Doesn't matter. And so I think, but for the most part, a lot of people just gotten like, hey, they're moving on. We're going to appreciate the circumstance and the takeaways that originally went on when they were here. Thank them for all this, whatever. And Brett Yormark certainly took that approach. Said, hey, we're going to celebrate them and what they've meant to this conference. Obviously, Oklahoma has the longer history in it, and just a lot of different things to take away. But there was no big bombshell out of it. Like, hey, the Big 12's rating so-and-so. That doesn't seem to be happening yet. Although, I don't know, might want to keep tabs on the Pac-12 TV situation, because even though for the last year we've supposedly been getting news within the next week, the next month, whenever that a deal was coming together, there still is no deal. Meanwhile, the ACC, just out of thin air, got a deal with the CW done to show some of their like regional telecast games. So that's interesting. And that was another thing that I took away from John Kurtz and Cole Manbeck's interview with Tim Weiser, was he said that, hey, I've been in this business a long time. If you have something good, you are telling everybody you can, and you're screaming it from the mountaintops, basically. And we have had none of that from the Pac-12. All we get from the Pac-12 and their overly friendly Pac-12 writers is, oh, a deal's coming. A deal's coming. Yeah, it's going to. Well, we've got zero specifics. We have zero idea what television situation is going to look like for them. So we didn't hear anything about that, and that'll be something, obviously, that might be a topic for next year's media days when it's just 12 teams instead of 14. But that'll do it for this episode of the EMA Online podcast. One other thing to take note of real quick before I get out of here is obviously I don't know who is going to listen to this immediately, but if you haven't followed along with all the exciting, times with K-State basketball right now, you are able to be aware that the alumni team, Purple and Black, is getting back together. They're doing things again. Well, tonight they are going to be at Bramlage Coliseum at 6:30 for like an open scrimmage, and then they're doing a meet and greet somewhere afterwards, because they're getting geared up to compete in TBT yet again. That is going to kick off next week. They are going to be in Wichita. So if you are ready for purple and black on Thursday next week, they're going to open up against a team called the Guys STL. I would imagine they are guys from St. Louis. But that's going to be something to follow along with when that all gets fired up. And I plan on being in attendance there next week because I enjoy the nostalgia of watching TBT. You know, you watched it on TV before. And I had gone, let's see, did I go the year prior? My first year in Wichita? I did. And K-State didn't have a team that year. And, you know, watched, I think I don't even know if I went. But last year, obviously being there, it is a fun thing. So it is something that you can do. And I would implore anybody that's like got nothing going on a Thursday next week, and you think, you know what, maybe I should go down there and watch. You should. It was a lot of fun. Obviously, watching Jacob Poland launch home the game winner and seeing a bunch of those guys on the floor together, and not to mention the team this year. There are even more guys that can help contribute to it. You know, in past years, it's been a little bit tough to get together like a full good roster for them. And this year, they are going to have a pretty good one put together. Obviously, two guys from the Elite 8 team this year, Desi Sills and Bebe Igiola, are playing for Purple and Black this year. That's fun. Jacob Poland's back. The man formerly known as Bill Walker is going to be playing there. DJ Johnson, Justin Edwards, Kamau Stokes healthy this year playing it. Marcus Foster is back this year. Didn't play with him last year, but he was kind of the hero when they tried to make that comeback against the Colorado alums. Mike McGurl's a guy that can step up. And then obviously guys that are still big names for K-State, like Martavius Irving and Thomas Gibson are going to be on the team as well. So I'll be there next week. Anything that I get from that, I'll throw up on Email Online and here on the Email Online YouTube page, just because I think it is a fun thing that I discredited at times. But when somebody representing your school is in it and you see all those guys that you have all these great memories of back on the floor, it is really fun. It can be an entertaining situation. So that is coming up next week, but they do have a thing tonight, Friday, July 14th, if you're listening to this and early enough, you're like, oh, yeah, maybe I need to scoot on over to Bramlage. So that will do it for this edition of the Email Online podcast, and we'll talk again soon. Keep following the Cats over on Email Online, where you can sign up right now at kansasState.rivals.com.